All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Diana Madsen, and welcome to the Mountain Pact's June 2016 Federal Policy Update Status webinar. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First off, we'll be circulating a recording of the webinar and slides to all attendees following the webinar. And secondly, Mountain Towns engaged with the Mountain Pact will get a spreadsheet detailing these policies following the webinar. And feel free to ask clarifying questions as we go, which you can enter into the chat box of the GoToWebinar window, or you can raise your hand, clicking that little hand icon, and you'll be unmuted to ask your question. So again, we'll do clarifying questions as we go. We'll have a few full Q&A section at the end. So with that, let's get started. So my name is Diana Madsen. I am the founder and executive director of the Mountain Pact. And with me presenting today is Maddie Reen, project director with the Mountain Pact. We'll start our discussion today with an overview of the Mountain Pact, which is very quick, and then we'll move into updates on the handful of policies that the Mountain Pact has been tracking closely and organizing around in 2016 and opportunities for engagement. Maddie will then take over to share a snapshot of about 9 other policies we've been tracking and that are relevant to Mountain Town. Then I'll share the research we've compiled on respective environmental agendas of the presumptive presidential candidates Clinton and Trump. And finally, we'll end with a Q&A. So to start, an overview of the Mountain Pact for those who are less familiar. With the support of the governments of Aspen, Lake Tahoe, Park City, Durango, and Vail, I launched the Mountain Pact in early 2014 as a vehicle for getting mountain communities a seat at the federal policy table. Mountain communities in the American West with outdoor recreation-based economies are uniquely affected by climate change and offer a critical perspective in climate, energy, and public lands policy discussions. Considering the economic impact facing mountain towns, coupled with the high-profile nature and influential tourist populations, we can be a pretty powerful voice in certain policy discussions. Now, in 2016, the Mountain Pact has a network of roughly 30 mountain towns, and we work to inform, empower, and mobilize them around critical policies related to climate, energy, and public lands. We work on issues that have the right mix of, on one side, impact to mountain towns, and on the other side, where mountain towns have an impact and the ability to make a meaningful difference. So now I'll run through 3 federal policies we've been actively working on with our partner communities and share some of the work we've been doing. So let's start with reform of the federal coal program, something we've been talking about a lot lately and you've probably heard from us about. So as background, 40% of the coal coming out of the U.S. is coming off of public lands. And this program is known as the Federal Coal Program. And the Federal Coal Program hasn't been updated in nearly 3 decades, and thus is woefully out of date when it comes to the royalty cost for private companies to access that coal and the environmental/climate impacts. Since early 2015, the Mountain Pact has been pushing the Obama administration to modernize the federal coal program to account for the climate, environmental, and public health impacts of federal coal, to ensure American taxpayers are earning a fair return on the use of their public resources, and to transition our nation to cleaner energy sources. This spring, President Obama and Interior Department Secretary Jewell heard our calls and announced a comprehensive programmatic environmental impact statement, the PEIS, of the federal coal leasing program. This is a huge success and step in the right direction. And the PEIS will consider, quote, how, when, and where to lease, how to account for the environmental and public health impacts of federal coal production, and how to ensure American taxpayers are earning a fair return for their use of public resources, unquote. Again, this is a huge success, especially considering that the Interior Department intends to finish the scoping plan for the PEIS before the end of the year and has placed a moratorium on all new coal leases while this review is taking place. So there's a lot that can be done in 2016 before the next president. As part of the review, Department of Interior is hosting public meetings and a written public comment period, which the Mountain Pact is actively engaged in. The Mountain Pact has been working on this for almost a year and a half now. In 2015, we submitted written comments twice, once to the Department of Interior and the second time to the Bureau of Land Management, and each were signed by over 10 mountain towns. We also coordinated 2 Mountain Pact delegations of town representatives to testify before BLM on the climate impacts facing their communities and the need to factor that into the federal coal program. When DORI responded positively in early 2016, we opted to keep pushing them and showing our support as they wrap up their coal reform efforts before the next president takes office. In April, the Mountain Pact had a delegation of town representatives go to DC to speak with Secretary Jewel herself, among White House staff and USDA staff. I'll share more about that later, but we definitely talked about this program. And in May, the Mountain Pact, alongside 2 representatives from the town of Alta, Utah, testified in front of the Department of Interior through their public listening sessions. And we'll be continuing this listening session tour again next week, first on Tuesday in Seattle, alongside council members from Bend and Hood River, Oregon, and Leavenworth, Washington. And then on Thursday, we'll be in Grand Junction with the mayor of Buena Vista and former mayor of Telluride. As so many of the mountain towns we work with are facing an unfortunate scheduling conflict with the Colorado Municipal League and CAST meetings happening the exact same day as the Grand Junction hearing, I'll be reading a statement on behalf of several elected officials in Grand Junction. If you haven't already joined that statement, please contact us. We'd love to have you as part of that. And on top of the verbal testimony, we're also submitting a written comment letter to the Interior Department in late July with a dozen or so mountain towns listed as signatories. So this will be a Western-wide letter from towns from Colorado all the way west to Oregon and the Pacific Coast. And we'll be accepting sign-on through July 20th. So in addition to these policy efforts, we're also supporting a hodgepodge of media opportunities, op-eds, policy analysis. So you can see there's a ton going on, and we're very interested in your participation as towns. So now moving on to wildfire funding reform. In the past decade, wildfires have increased in frequency and severity. Oh, actually, you know what? We have a question. Let me take a quick look. All right, we'll come back to one of those questions after the webinar. So in the past, go back to wildfire funding reform. In the past decade, wildfires have increased in frequency and severity, burning 50% more land than in the previous 4 decades. The fire season is 2 months longer, and the average size of fires is 5 times greater than in the 1970s. So in short, wildfires are becoming more frequent and more intense, and thus more expensive. In order to protect communities in the wildland-urban interface, the WUIs, which make up virtually all of the mountain towns we work with, significant levels of funding, particularly around wildfire prevention, are needed to address this increase in the frequency and severity of wildfires. Moreover, communities surrounded by public lands are hurting economically when the Forest Service and Interior Department transfer funding away from important functions like fire prevention and maintenance on recreation infrastructure for fire suppression. So something to keep in mind here is that wildfire, unlike other natural disasters such as hurricanes and flooding, does not have access to a disaster fund, such as, for example, FEMA is a disaster fund. And so as a result, when wildfire suppression costs are more than what was budgeted, Forest Service and Interior Department have to pull money away from other programs that were allocated in normal programs as part of their land management budgets. There are several draft bills circulating around Congress to address these growing challenges of catastrophic wildfire, including the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act, the Wildfire Budgeting Response and Forest Management Act, and the Westerman Bill, which is part of the energy bill that we'll go into more detail with later. We're very interested in finding a policy and enacting a policy that would, 1, minimize the transfer of funds, that is, taking money away from management programs to pay for the ever-increasing cost of fighting wildfires. 2, a policy that will allow access to disaster funding outside of agencies' discretionary funds, so for example, something like FEMA for wildfire. And 3, to address how the increasing 10-year average cuts into the Forest Service and Interior Department budgets impacting funding for programs crucial to ensuring adequate forest management, especially as temperatures warm and drought conditions increase. A few updates since we presented in January. In late 2015, Congress did appropriate the wildland fire fighting and prevention programs for Forest Service and Interior Department at $4 billion to fully fund the 10-year average for wildland fire suppression costs. This is great news for this fiscal year, so long as on-the-ground conditions and suppression responses are true to forecast and there is potential for another a no-transfer year. However, this relief is only for this year. It's not a permanent solution. And our communities and land managers should have more stability to ensure long-term budgetary stability for restoration, recreation, fish and wildlife, forestry management, and the list goes on. And we had a question to explain more about the increasing 10-year average. Thank you for the question. So to clarify, so the 10-year average is, let's see how to best frame this. So the 10-year average is the average cost of wildfire suppression across 10 years. And this is the number that's used for forecasting and budgeting to identify how much should be allocated to suppress wildfire. And this number is, the 10-year average number doesn't necessarily reflect how much, we've been proven wrong a number of times with the 10-year average in terms of how much it actually costs to suppress wildfire in any given year, because the average is increasing as fires are happening at different times of year. They're bigger, they're more expensive, they're happening in new places, et cetera. And so as a result, for example, in 2016, the 10-year average between 2006 and 2016 might not reflect the conditions and the wildfire we'll see coming up into this season. And so there's interest, and we're looking to support an increase in the 10-year average, so we're not locked into numbers from the past, but able to address the current situation around wildfire. So in terms of what the Mountain Pact has been doing around wildfire funding fix, it is a critical issue to the towns we work with who are vulnerable to the catastrophic wildfire, both in terms of public health and safety and their tourism-based economies. Communities surrounded by public lands hurt economically when the Forest Service and Interior Department transfer funding away from important functions like fire prevention, forest health, and recreation infrastructure maintenance to deal with fire suppression. And so many of the towns on the phone right now, you probably know that you've seen the last decade or so your local Forest Service or Park Service departments, their budget's just going down significantly, and a lot of the activities they're responsible for doing, they're just not doing because there's no money there, and it's being transferred away to pay for wildfire suppression on a national basis. And so the Mountain Pact has worked with and will continue to work together with a national coalition to shape and inform a long-term and comprehensive policy that will not only provide additional funding for wildfire suppression, but address how the increasing 10-year average cuts into the Forest Service and Interior Department budgets, impacting funding for programs crucial to ensuring adequate forest management. So another aspect there around the 10-year average is that if there's not a disaster cap access somewhere else, we just see that the increasing cost of wildfire suppression ends up eating up a bigger and bigger and bigger part of the budget for Forest Service and Interior Department. And the result, and then unless there's more money going into their budgets, it means that's just pulling out from other proactive programs that are so important. In the fall of 2014, communities including Aspen, Vail, Durango, Park City, Ketchum, Lake Tahoe, and Bend all sent individual letters to and met with, many of them met with their congressional representatives in support of wildfire funding reform. In fall of 2015, Park City and Lake Tahoe submitted a second round of letters to their congressional delegation urging funding reform. Just this last spring in April, we have an image here of our delegation of mountain town representatives, including going from left to right, Bend, Lake Tahoe, Telluride, and Durango. Together we went to DC to speak with the White House, Forest Service, USDA, and Department of Interior, as well as congressional staff on this issue. Going into fall, we're preparing for another big budget deal, which is an opportunity for wildfire funding reform. And so these things happen very quickly. We've seen some progress on them in the last couple of years. For example, the funding for this fiscal year around fire funding came in the budget to last year. And so we're going to be organizing a town sign-on letter and op-eds, but we're going to try to be ready when this quick, it happens very quickly this time around. So we'll be doing a sign-on letter probably circulating in August so that we have our letter, all of our signatories ready to go. So then if we have 48 hours notice to get a letter in come September, October, December, we're able to quickly submit that. So stay tuned for more information there. And so another policy we've been tracking closely, and this will be the last one I do a more in-depth conversation around, but this looks at measurement of the outdoor recreation industry as part of the UTA GDP. So according to a broad estimate by the Outdoor Industry Association, the outdoor recreation industry generates more or nearly $650 billion in consumer spending each year and supports more than 6 million American jobs. However, unlike other major sectors in the U.S. economy, the federal government does not track the contributions of the outdoor recreation sector to economic growth. And this leaves policymakers and business leaders in the dark, and really is a handicap for this industry to not have these numbers to showcase the need for protection and investment into the outdoor recreation world. The Outdoor Rec Act, so the Recreation Economic Contributions Act, is a piece of bipartisan legislation that would inform policymakers and business leaders on the jobs created and the consumer spending driven by the outdoor recreation economy. The bill would direct and fund the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Department of Commerce to measure the outdoor recreation industry. And something to keep in mind is that Congress very much has a precedent of funding these types of studies. Just in the last couple of years, they funded the Hollywood and theater industry study to measure and qualify that industry's impact on the GDP. So asking them to do the same thing for the outdoor rec industry would make a lot of sense. And in April, we had an exciting announcement where Secretary Jewell announced that the Department of Interior would fund year one of a 3-year study, but Congress does need to fund the rest. So it's a 3-year study, and we need funding for each year in order to make that happen. The announcement adds urgency to the legislation, the Outdoor Rec Act, pending in Congress, that would fund and mandate the rest of the study. To get a sense of how big the outdoor rec industry is, according to Secretary Jewell, industry estimates show that consumer spending for outdoor recreation is almost equal to pharmaceuticals and motor vehicles and parts combined. I'm going to say that again. So it's almost equal to pharmaceuticals, motor vehicles, and parts combined. And yet the federal government has never fully recognized or qualified these benefits. That's a huge source of funding. So while this policy isn't directly related to climate change or public lands, it has major impacts indirectly. If we had a federally backed number behind the outdoor rec industry, it would give us incredible leverage to push policymakers to protect and invest in the health of our public lands that underpin this huge economy. So the Mountain Pact is following this very closely. We're gearing up to make a big push with the next administration so we can see that this is funded. So now I'm going to turn it over to Maddie to give a high-level overview of 9 other federal policies germane to mountain communities, though these are policies the Mountain Pact isn't organizing around. Oh, wait, quick question, going back to the slide before. The Outdoor Rec Bill is brilliant. What other NGO and private sector partners are you working with on this? I very much agree. I think it's a great opportunity, and it doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily need to see Congress fund it through the Outdoor Rec Bill exactly. I think we just need to find the right vehicle to make this funded. But to list some of the other partners working on it, I mean, pretty much everybody's supportive of it. The Outdoor Industry Association, so we've had a number of conversations with them that they've been interested in this. Makes a lot of sense for their trade group. But also the Center for American Progress has done studies over the years around the Count My Job initiative. And so we'll be coordinating with both of those to make sure that efforts around making sure that the outdoor recreation industry is funded, we're working together and complementing our different efforts. All right, so I'll turn it over to Maddie to talk through other important policies, but those that we aren't digging in at in terms of campaigning at the moment. So Maddie, you're able to jump, are you there?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Diana. We can go ahead and skip to the next slide. All right, so the Recreation Not Red Tape Act comes from Senator Wyden out of Oregon. Wyden states that this act focuses on how to remove bureaucratic roadblocks to recreating on public lands. The bill is based on draft legislation Wyden released last fall on concerns he heard during a series of listening sessions held on a statewide tour of Oregon's 7 Wonders last summer. Wyden then introduced the final act in March this year and states that if passed, it would increase capacity for gateway communities to offer diverse outdoor recreation options, which is relevant for many Western communities with tourism-based economies. Next slide, please. The Land and Water Conservation Fund program provides matching grants to states and local governments for the acquisition and development of public outdoor recreation areas and facilities. There was a moment of doubt in the fall of 2015 that the Land and Water Conservation Fund was not going to be reauthorized, but as part of Congress's year-end budget bill, which passed in December of 2015, the program was refunded for the next 3 years. After that scare, on February 4th, President Obama proposed a permanent reauthorization of the fund in his 2017 budget request. If this is approved by Congress, the fund would receive $900 million annually to fund recreation and conservation of public lands. This is an important piece of legislation as the program is intended to create, protect, and maintain a nationwide legacy of high-quality recreation areas and facilities. Next slide, please. In January of 2015, the Department of Interior announced its plan to reduce harmful methane emissions from new and existing oil and gas operations on public lands managed by the BLM. Their goal was to end the practice of venting natural gas, phasing out flaring from operations, and requiring quarterly monitoring to detect leaks. So a year later, after that announcement, the BLM released proposed methane waste rule, and now in May, they have a final version of these rules, which will attempt to trim emissions from operations by 40% down to 45% from the 2012 levels, which will occur over the next decade. Leaks and emissions from natural gas and oil production account for nearly a third of the atmospheric methane, according to the EPA. And methane, a primary component in natural gas, has a greenhouse gas effect that is 25 times more powerful than that of carbon dioxide, making this rule relevant to mountain towns as it drastically cuts natural gas waste from drilling operations on public lands that contribute to climate change. Next slide, please. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Clean Power Plan that would require individual states to meet specific standards with respect to reduction of carbon emissions depending on their energy consumption. Unfortunately, in mid-February, the Supreme Court issued a stay of the EPA's Clean Power Plan, halting implementation. There were 5 separate stay applications filed by more than 24 states and numerous industry groups. Many legal experts state that the plan has a solid foundation in existing law under the Clean Air Act and predict the plan will prevail in court. So we'll be watching this to see what happens. But the implementation of the Clean Power Plan is important as it will reduce the U.S.'s contributions to climate change, help meet the country's Paris Climate Agreement commitments, and reduce pollutants that contribute to smog and heat. Next, please. All right, so the energy bill is a broad, sweeping proposal that includes a mix of topics. Within the policy package, there is language that addresses energy efficiency and technology measures to allow more clean energy onto the grid, weatherization programs to improve residential energy efficiency, or codify lower energy in federal buildings. It also redefines biomass as carbon neutral and even establishes a National Park Service maintenance and revitalization fund, just to name a few. The energy bill is very diverse in topics. And in mid-April, the bill passed in Senate and was introduced to the House the last week of May. So we will be seeing markup from the House on June 22nd. We'll stay tuned for details on that. We also want to flag that recently within the energy bill package, a provision titled the Westerman Bill was revised, and the language has great improvements towards meeting a comprehensive fire funding fix. All of these components are relevant to mountain towns and the nation, as the energy bill is the first major update to the nation's energy policy in almost a decade. As well, it begins to address funding for water conservation, national parks, smart grid, and clean energy. Next slide, please. In response to heightened national droughts, President Obama issued a memorandum of understanding concerning long-term drought resilience. The memorandum institutionalizes national drought resilience partnerships aimed at collaborating with communities impacted by drought to reduce its threat through federal support. In addition to the memorandum, the White House recently announced pledges of billions of dollars of private capital that will be deployed specifically for sustainable water infrastructure projects. The memorandum stresses the importance of collaboration between federal agencies, local governments, and organizations in order to effectively mitigate the increased dangers of drought, which is a step in the right direction for long-term water conservation, especially for Western mountain towns who are headwaters to numerous downstream users. Next slide, please. Also on the Mountain Pact radar is the need to modernize FEMA policies that better equip communities to the new threats of climate change. The existing FEMA programs don't help communities prepare for extreme weather. They are only responsive. So it's time to be proactive and recognize that change is here. In recent years, Obama asked Congress for more funding for pre-disaster hazard mitigation grants, but Congress allocated only $25 million. In his 2016 budget request, Obama asked for 8 times that much at $200 million. This is relevant to mountain communities as FEMA funding structures are out of date and do not support proactive adaptation and preparedness, nor do they take into account the increasing number of natural disasters expected as a result of climate change, showing a need for action. Next slide, please. A collaborative effort comprised of more than 25 agencies, of which are currently developing a climate resilience roadmap, are aimed to identify opportunities beyond this administration to prepare for, adapt to, and withstand climate impacts. The roadmap will focus primarily on priorities to guide federal actions on how to enhance community resilience across the nation, recognizing that resilience requires collaboration amongst federal, state, local, tribal, and non-governmental partners for success. There was a listening session the end of May that the Mountain Pact testified at, and the group hopes to publish a report by the end of the Obama administration. This work is relevant as federal foresight is crucial to ensure that governmental programs are in place for communities to plan, prepare, and build climate resilience into our infrastructure and natural landscapes. Next slide, please. The last topic I will speak on today is the Paris Climate Agreement, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's the historic international effort to institutionalize global climate adaptation and mitigation of greenhouse gases. Specifically, the agreement aims to prevent the global climate from warming more than 2 degrees Celsius, with the eventual goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, among many other provisions. Since the international conference, France and Morocco have co-published a roadmap intended to support the early implementation of the agreement. This includes a consultative process designed to promote input and feedback from governments and non-state actors through a series of events in the build-up to COP22, a UN climate summit that will take place in Morocco November 7th through the 18th of this year. This is important to mountain towns as it is a culmination of broader efforts by nations, businesses, cities, and citizens to reorient the global economy to a path of low carbon growth. It's also important to note that the next president, in theory, could pull out of the agreement before the commitment deadline of January 2017. And that's a great segue into our next section where Diana will discuss the presumptive presidential candidates' environmental viewpoints.
Thanks so much, Maddie. So as said, I'm going to dive into our analysis on the environmental agendas of both presumptive candidates. We put this information together through a mix of review of campaign websites, some speeches, etc. It's important to keep in mind, as you all know, that what is said on the campaign trail is not always what the president enacts, but this will at least give you a flavor of their perspective. So let's start with Donald Trump. I have to say that it was a very fascinating exercise, spending several hours with a deep dive into everything he's ever said about the environment. And this is what a high-level overview of what I came up with. First off, he's a climate science denier and has often called climate change, quote, phony and, quote, a hoax. He's vowed to rescind U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Agreement. And in a May interview, he said, quote, I will be looking at that very, very seriously, and at a minimum, I will be renegotiating those agreements at a minimum. At a maximum, I may do something else. He also said he did not believe that China would adhere to its pledge under the Paris Climate Deal, which is completely baseless. But this actually answers one of our questions that came in. Experts say China is already well on its way toward meeting its obligations under the Paris Agreement, thanks to major investments in clean energy and energy efficiency. Once the accord is, so in terms of the agreement and what Trump could do if he was president is, so once the accord is ratified by 55 countries responsible for 55% of global emissions, it will enter into legal force. And any country wishing to withdraw will have to wait 4 years to do so. However, if the deal has not been ratified by January 2017, a new American president could withdraw immediately. So for that reason, many countries who are concerned that President Trump would withdraw are racing to ratify the deal this year. Trump has also pledged on the domestic front to dismantle the EPA, and his new energy advisor, North Dakota Representative Kevin Cramer, has said that the Clean Power Plan, the Clean Water Rule, and methane emission standards are all, quote, regulations that Mr. Trump might do away with if he were president, unquote. Trump has also attacked renewables. In his book, he wrote, quote, there has been a big push to develop alternative forms of energy, so-called green energy, from renewable sources. That's a big mistake. To begin with, the whole push for renewable energy is being driven by the wrong motivation, the mistaken belief that global climate change is being caused by carbon emissions. If you don't buy that, and I don't, then what we have is really just an expensive way of making the tree huggers feel good about themselves, unquote. He also supports expanding use of fossil fuels. He vowed to revive the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. He claimed he would reopen shuttered mines and get coal miners back to work, despite multiple experts and fact checkers who have stated that his promise to restore coal industry employment is unrealistic due to inexpensive natural gas, reduced demand for coal exports, and advances in mining technology. He also has promised to make the U.S. independent from foreign oil providers by use of untapped domestic oil and gas reserves. He stated he believes oil spills are just the cost of doing business and they will be fine after the cleanup, and he supports fracking. One thing that was surprising I came across is on the public lands front, he is against the transfer of public lands to the states. So he wants to keep public lands currently under federal control to continue to be under federal control. And now let's move on to Hillary Clinton. So Clinton's website offered a fair amount of information. And also on her some speeches, she's had a great deal of specificity around her environmental agenda compared to Trump. And also something to note is based on her campaign advisors involved at this point, if elected, it is expected that she'd push forward with much of the environmental agenda started by the Obama administration. But let's start with the top. Her general stance on climate change is that it's, quote, an urgent threat and a defining challenge of our time, unquote. And her campaign has committed to, quote, lead the world in the fight against climate change by bringing greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below what they were in 2005 within the next decade and keep going. So she's very the Paris Climate Agreement and has pledged to join other rich nations in providing funding to poor nations for climate adaptation. On the domestic environmental policy front, she would defend the Clean Power Plan. She has a number of commitments, including to 1, cut waste in American homes, schools, and hospitals and offices by 1/3 and make American manufacturing the cleanest, most efficient in the world. 2, reduce American oil consumption by 1/3 through cleaner fuels and more efficient cars, boilers, ships, and trucks. 3, defend, implement, and extend smart pollution and efficiency standards, including the Clean Power Plan, and efficiency standards for cars, trucks, and appliances that are already reducing energy costs for American households and businesses by over $75 billion per year. She also, and her 4th commitment is to cut methane emissions across the country by 40 to 45% and put in place strong standards for reducing leaks from both new and existing sources. Her renewable energy goals are along the same lines. She wants to install more than 500 million solar panels across the country by the end of her first term, generating enough renewable energy to power every home in 10 years. She signed a pledge to power at least half of the nation's energy needs with renewable sources by 2030. And she plans to launch a $60 billion clean energy challenge to partner with states, cities, and rural communities and give them the tools and resources they need to go beyond the federal standards in cutting carbon pollution and expanding clean energy. They write, quote, the Clean Energy Challenge will also help ensure all Americans share in the benefits of the clean energy economy by encouraging solar and energy efficiency investments in low-income communities. On the oil and gas development front, she said she'd prohibit drilling in the waters of the Arctic and the Atlantic. She opposes the Keystone XL pipeline. She sees natural gas as a necessary bridge fuel, but that fracking needs to be heavily regulated. And she said she would, quote, end wasteful tax subsidies for oil and gas companies and invest in clean energy, end quote. On the public lands front, when she was in the Senate, she voted for notable public lands protection bills. Her website states that, quote, as president, Hillary would reform fossil fuel leasing and significantly expand clean energy production on public lands. She's against the transfer of public lands to states, and she has some interesting commitments around public lands that include, 1, setting a goal of doubling the size of the outdoor economy within 10 years, creating millions of new jobs and up to $700 billion in new annual economic activity. She wants to establish an American Parks Trust Fund to scale up and modernize how we protect and enhance our country's great outdoors. 3, to expand access to public lands for hunting, fishing, and recreation by making publicly accessible 50% of public land that is currently inaccessible. And 4th, to combat our national water challenges, including through a new water innovation lab and Western Water Partnership. So that is a snapshot of Hillary Clinton's environmental agenda. Again, we can't take these policies for granted, but they do give us a sense of what we are voting for. So that wraps up our presentation. As a reminder, going forward, the Mountain Pact will continue to push forward on these policies around coal royalty reform, public lands and wildfire reform, investment in drought resilience, and funding for the outdoor recreation industry study. If there are other policy efforts that you think would be a good fit for us, or you're interested in getting involved in, please let us know, and maybe it's something we can start working on or put you in touch with those who are already working on it. And we'll likely be hosting another webinar along these lines in fall, but we'll see how crazy things get with the campaign and how much there is to report. So before I open it up to Q&A, as a reminder, I'll be sending around the slides and recording later today or tomorrow. Towns working with the Mountain Pact will receive a spreadsheet breaking down the different policies. And if you're interested in learning more about the Mountain Pact, you can visit our website or contact us at the information here. So with that, let's open it up to questions. To ask a question, you can either enter it into the GoToWebinar question box or click the hand icon, and you raise your hand and I'll unmute you. All right. Not seeing any questions. Oh, a whole bunch just came in. So one question is, what is the Mountain Pact's policy/role in the transfer of the public lands movement? So the Mountain Pact is supportive of keeping public lands with the federal government, as we feel they would be most adequately managed, especially if we have some funding reform taking place. But we haven't worked on that. We haven't really dug into that issue. I think that goes back to when assessing the Mountain Pact, we have limited capacity. We really try to pick the policies where we think have the most impact on the towns we work with, and also where the towns could have the biggest impact on them. So for example, we opted to not double down our resources on the Clean Power Plan because it was such a crowded field. We didn't think we would be the value add that would make the most sense for the organization. So the public lands movement at this point is along the same lines, where there's so many players involved that we are following it. We do support not transferring lands to the states, but would be interested if one of our towns on our steering committee felt very strongly about it, we would definitely consider engaging more. Another question is, can you provide more information on the listening session in Seattle on June 21st? So this is the listening session taking place next Tuesday, and part of a series of 6 listening sessions hosted by the Department of Interior. So the way it's going to work, we were at the Salt Lake City one in May. It's from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., though we'll be lining up to get speaker spots starting around 7 a.m. that day. And then it will just be a brief presentation by the Department of Interior at 10, followed by, 6 hours of presentation after that, where it's 6 hours of public comment. So everybody gets 3 minutes to go up, share their perspective, and then on to the next speaker. So the Seattle one will likely be friendlier for the environmental community as compared to the Grand Junction and the Salt Lake ones, which there was a heavy Friends of Coal presence there. But it's really important for the Department of Interior, and there'll be a panel of high-level officials, potentially Secretary Jewell, even up there, hearing from these perspectives, especially around climate change. And so we did participated in listening sessions with some of the people on the line actually last summer. Got a huge positive feedback from the BLM in response to those. So that's some information. And Jillian, if you want to email me, would be happy to share more information if you want to be part of our group. Another question of creating a JPEG of the presumptive candidate slides to circulate. Would be happy. Yep, it'll be part of the PowerPoint PDF will be circulating. And I'll send that over to you, Chris, and to everybody else. And if you want more information beyond that, just follow up with me once you see the slides. And another question is, when will we receive the slides from the presentation? I'll send around the slides in the YouTube video, ideally today, but sometimes YouTube takes a minute for the video to get fully uploaded, so it could be as late as tomorrow, but expect them today or tomorrow. All right, any other questions? Oh yeah, another question that came in. Can you please do a recap of the main priorities for the Mountain Pact in the next 6 months, the main things we can expect to hear about? This is the list, but I want to have the caveat of, because it's an election year, it's really hard to know exactly how to expect what's going to happen in fall. And so, for example, we could have a major showdown around the budget that could be used as a campaign tactic, or it could be quietly done, or it could even get pushed off until at the last possible minute. So depending on how things go, these are the priorities we're looking at right now and trying to gear up to be ready to respond to quickly, which are going to be the coal royalty reform issue, which we're going to be wrapping up in June with the listening sessions, and then July with the written comment submitting. And then we'll be seeing if the Interior Department is able to get the scoping plan done by the end of the year. We'll also be watching closely the wildfire and public lands funding opportunity. This would be part of a budget solution, and again, that's very hard to predict what exactly that's going to look like, and especially in an election year where it could be leveraged for either candidate. And so our tactic around that is to get some things ready, get some letters ready to go in August so we can move quickly if the opportunity does come up. We've been pushing for federal investment in drought resilience. I'm not entirely confident we'll see a lot more happening on that front as we move into the fall, but we'll be watching that. And then the outdoor recreation industry study, I highly doubt we'll see that happen in 2016. However, we're watching it closely. I've started to develop a campaign strategy to how we can get in with a transition team with the next administration and start talking about this issue really early on. Any other questions? We had a couple other questions come in about yesterday's spending bill with the EPA. That's something I'll follow up with you directly about that, Chris. Well, great. We're about 5 minutes or 10 minutes before the hour. Looks like we have just a couple last notes coming in, thanking us for the webinar. Thank you all for your participation and your interest and engagement in these issues. Working with you is the reason why we do this. And so stay tuned to hear from us with more information and the slides, etc. Feel free to contact me anytime to discuss engagement and opportunities and such. And have a great rest of your week. Thank you.